Okay, so welcome to Grief Chat with myself, Mark Lemon. For this series of interviews, I'll be speaking with inspirational people about their unique experiences with grief. I'm delighted to kick off my first episode of the Good Grief Festival with therapist and filmmaker Jane Harris and therapist and author Gill Mann. Firstly, I guess my first question would be kicking off whether you could share with the viewers about your own individual experiences with grief, please. And I'll go to you first, Gill, please.
Yes. The deepest grief that I've ever experienced was when my son Sam died, which was 6 years ago. He was 22 years old and he was away traveling in Thailand when a young policewoman knocked on my door and told me that that Sam had been found dead in his hostel room. Now, Sam was the second of my three children. He was bright, he was funny, he was a bit wacky. He was also unbelievably contrary as a human being, and a really, really challenging kid to parent. But he was an absolute joy too. So that was obviously, it was devastating to know that he had died. I think my grieving was actually, it wasn't just for Sam's death, actually. There was this sort of second layer to my grief, and I think that is because Sam had been really quite unwell for the last few years of his life. In his late teens, he started to have psychotic episodes. And after a really, really difficult time, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so I think when he died, it was, I had so much to try to make sense of. I had to make sense of all of that too. So I think writing actually became my way of making sense of it, trying to make sense of all of it.
I know I can speak firsthand. Creativity is hugely powerful when healing your own grief.
It is.
And how about yourself, Jane?
So my son Josh died aged 22. He had been traveling in Vietnam, actually. He was having the time of his life. He was in a really good place. He had a job at the Ministry of Sound as a young producer. He'd gone from this gangly young man with no confidence to this amazing kind of man about town who was independent. And I'd kind of let go. Roots and wings, I'd said, I've kind of done my job now, it's over to him. And I kind of relaxed, as parents do. And he was having a whale of a time, but then that knock at the door that no parent ever thinks they're going to get, young policeman and woman, telling me that Josh had been killed in a road incident in Vietnam on this trip of a lifetime. And in the blink of an eye, my world was changed, is changed forever. And the shock and the trauma that kicks in is beyond words. Because sometimes words, however much creativity plays a part in my grief processing, sometimes words don't work. And maybe that's why film and writing and running creative retreats is our way of working with it. But the gap in my life is huge. It's now been nearly 10 years since Josh died. And I can say that the grief is less jagged around the edges. And I can say I have accepted his death. And I can say that I live well with the knowledge that he has died. However, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him and miss him. And I'm okay with that. But I would say, and it may be part of our conversation now, that a lot of people aren't okay with that.
But I was wondering whether we could talk a bit about, what made you want to go and write and speak openly about your experiences with grief and the way that you've done it so fantastically. I was just wondering whether you could share how you've done this.
So sharing Josh is difficult because as a therapist, we learn that boundaries are very important, and sharing our stories is complicated enough. But actually, if you lock up something that is so fundamentally life-changing, it's got nowhere to go. And I think that we have to process what is and work with what is and try and make sense of something that makes no sense. So as a filmmaker, initially, I met Jimmy, Josh's dad, at film school way back in the 80s. And we hit it off straight away in terms of making films. And when Josh died, there was something about looking for that familiar creative expression whereby we could speak a language that we understood, which was filmic, which was visual, which was about the huge archive that we had of Josh's life, the photographs, the stories. And somehow that really helped us in the early months. I mean, of course, you know, like Jill, we had to organize a funeral, a ritual. What do you do when your child dies abroad? You don't have a chance to say goodbye. So we had to create a goodbye. And the first film we made was called Beyond Goodbye. And that was about the funeral in Josh's memory, actually the celebration of his life, at which his friends came, and they created the most beautiful, beautiful event in his name at a wonderful venue that seemed right. And I think Josh would have loved it. But what we learned is that ritual helps, and that the funeral and the celebration of his life helped his friends and us acknowledge that he really was dead. He wasn't lost. He hadn't gone somewhere. He wasn't waiting to be found. He was dead. And it took me a long time to use that word.
I mean, we had the same experience, that actually the ritual of saying goodbye to Sam was really important. We hadn't been able to see his body, so it was very important for us to have something that marked, the end, the deadness of him. So we had a funeral in Bangkok, a Buddhist cremation, which we felt he would have liked. And subsequently, when we got back home again, we had a much bigger funeral, which was fantastic, which was very much a celebration of his life. And Jane talked about having, you know, films being her language in a way, and I suppose words on pages, or as it is nowadays on the screen, that's my language. It was always, I always found it much easier to write than to talk. And actually, when things happened in my life, whether they were either really difficult or really good and happy, I would find myself writing. And so what made me want to write was actually not even something as conscious as a wish to write. I literally, sort of 2 days after this Buddhist cremation, quite a few of the family had gone home back to the UK, but I had remained in Bangkok with my 2 daughters. And we went up to Pai, which was where Sam had actually died. And we spent a few days there. And it was on the first night there that I just found myself, one of those nights when I quite simply couldn't sleep, just reaching for an iPad. And I started to write, and it was like an unstoppable sort of flow. Once I'd started, I literally couldn't stop. And for 2 years, I just sat and tapped away on this little iPad whenever and wherever I could. And it was so much a part of my grieving process. I think it was my way of facing grief head on. I think what I realized from my work with people, as Jane said, you know, people don't feel very comfortable sort of facing grief. They do all sorts of things to try to avoid it. And I'd worked with so many people who actually had needed to come to see me because this unresolved grief had really sort of jumped back up and really was interfering with their life. And so I just didn't want that to happen. So I think there was quite a conscious element too, but it was very much a need. So that was the writing. And then I got to the end of my writing. By then I had 180,000 words, which is about twice the length of a sort of normal novel. And I started to think about whether it might be helpful to share Sam's story. And like Jane, there is a huge resistance in me and also, you know, in other people in the family to to putting Sam out there in the world. But I think there is also something rather lovely about feeling that I'm keeping him alive in a way, you know, in a very different way, but I am sort of keeping him in readers' minds. And actually writing for me was a way of spending time with Sam. It really was. And part of my book is really a conversation with Sam. So yeah, so it was about wanting to share my experience, because I felt that people are so bad around grief. You know, they're around people who are grieving, but they're also bad around grief. And I felt quite a pressure actually to be all right. And people would say things like, oh, you know, just have something nice in your diary to look forward to. And it felt so utterly sort of inadequate, really, you know, as a salve supposedly for what I was feeling. So I felt really that it would be good for people to really get inside the mind of a grieving mother and to know what it felt like. And actually, hopefully, for people to feel less afraid of it, less afraid of being around grief, to feel they had the tools perhaps to cope with it, because it doesn't take very much. It really just takes someone saying, I'm so sorry. You know, I think that's all you need to hear.
So there's a deafening silence around grief. It creates so much discomfort in others. That it's a very lonely place to be. And I think, you know, as Jill says, she wrote, and Jimmy, my partner, my husband, wrote too. And in fact, within a few months of Josh dying, he'd written a book with photographs around, I mean, he was lost, and writing helped him find himself again. He'd lost his identity as a dad, and I had lost my identity. I felt I'd failed Josh somehow. And this deafening silence didn't start straight away. In fact, there was a lot of noise in the early stages of love and concern and compassion. But once the funeral's over, you're on your own. And I think it's a real shock to discover that the discomfort outweighs the comfort. When it comes to how do people approach the bereaved, they tell you how you will get better, and they give you a formula, so well-intentioned, always well-intentioned. But the problem is that, you know, there's so many cliches, like people saying, I don't want to remind you of your son, or that he died, you know, I don't want to mention him. And, you know, you think to yourself, well, would I forget? I mean, a child is for life, a child is forever. You know, you love your child for as long as you live. And I think for us, filmmaking is a way of creating an experience that allows other people to walk in our shoes if they want to understand what it really feels like if they want to. And what I've learned in the last 10 years is that that takes a lot of courage for people to want to know what it feels like, because I wouldn't want to know what this feels like. I didn't want to know what this feels like. And I'm sure Jill might, well, Jill can herself, but, you know, you have to opt in. And one of the talks that we give is to police, actually, about how do you deliver bad news. And the first thing I would say is that you have to get over this idea that it's for fixing and that it's for mending. The very first thing you have to do is to accept the discomfort. Once you've accepted that this is uncomfortable, in a way you can help others. And I am helped by people being uncomfortable alongside me. Otherwise, of course, what you find yourself doing is making everybody comfortable. And it's very timely, really, to talk about wearing a mask, because as a bereaved mum, I've been wearing a mask a lot of the time since my son died. And making films is a way of taking off that mask and saying, this is what it really feels like. And this is what bereavement, you know, to lose anyone in the wrong order of thing is very different from losing someone in the right order of thing. And I've experienced the death of my mum, dad, and beloved mother-in-law within a few years of Josh dying. But Josh's death was catastrophic. It was never supposed to happen. And it, as a therapist, I suppose I know that trauma takes you back to your early pain and your early issues, and it opened everything up for me. and it took the scab off some unhealed stuff, which I had to delve into and get help with to process other losses in my life that I hadn't named. And that's the nature of grief. You have to dig deep, and you have to, well, you don't have to, actually, but I had to, because I knew if I didn't, it was going to come out either mentally, psychologically, or physically. Because the thing about this grief thing is that it will out. It finds a way out, whether you like it or not. And if you button it up and put a lid on it, tragically, it shows itself. And so I had to catch up with that idea. And I also didn't want to be alone in the world, but surrounded by people who were too uncomfortable. So I suppose my address book changed, and I had to kind of think about who I could be with and who wanted to be with me. And a lot of people didn't want to be, and why would they? And I think that's difficult. It's a secondary loss, but it's an important one to process.
Yeah. I guess also the big elephant in the room this year, COVID-19. I'm just wondering if it's impacted on your grief at all. Now, I know, Jane, obviously, you're doing a lot of work around that at the moment.
My own reflection is that as a bereaved mother, as a bereaved parent, you're living in lockdown a lot of the time anyway, because in a way, you're on your own with your grief a lot of the time, and you have to find a way of adapting to this new normal. And that might be becoming more self-contained, it might be communicating in a different way. But the thing that's been really interesting for me is that as a bereaved mum, you learn to wear a mask, not because you want to wear a mask, but because it's easier for other people. Right now, we're all wearing masks, and it's so strange when you go around and people can't see your mouth, because your mouth speaks, and you start to speak with your eyes. And it's really complicated, isn't it? Because as a bereaved parent, you represent the worst nightmare that there is for people. And I suppose the isolation that is lockdown for a lot of people has been welcomed by quite a few bereaved people that we've spoken to, because in a way they don't have to put on that mask. They don't have to put on that pretense. They've got an excuse. We've got an excuse to self-isolate if we want to. There's less pressure. We're working in a different way. But on the other hand, it's really important to actually stay in touch with the reality of grief. And that means exposing the true feelings and moving forward. And I suppose, I think for a lot of bereaved people, I've been really interested to hear them say that lockdown has been welcome and it's not unfamiliar at all. And that actually it's given them a bit of respite.
I agree too with everything that Jane said then. I think interestingly for me, I've, in a way, I think my grief has had quite a bizarrely positive impact on my experience of COVID-19. Because I think so many of the things that I've learned from surviving the death of Sam, from finding a way through, have actually served me quite well. My world as I knew it ended 6 years ago. And now, of course, we're all facing a world that is ending as we've always known it. And but I suppose what I can take from having survived that is that life will still go on. I mean, it will be different, but it will go on. I think I've also learned to trust that however, bad things feel and however frightening they feel, feelings do pass. They do move on. And in a way, when we're really up against it, we have to sort of let go of the normal things that we expect of ourselves. And sometimes, just getting out of bed might be a real achievement on a day. And I think, all we can do in this situation at the moment is live life a day at a time. It's not, we can't really look to the future. And actually that's very similar to grieving. I suppose the other thing is that from losing Sam, you know, I have discovered that even though it's been the most catastrophic loss in my life and my family's life, there are things that we have gained. You know, there are some good things that come out of it. And I suppose that's all we can hope really from the COVID situation, is that we won't all wake up and just go straight back to normal, but actually we will have learnt something from it.
Mm. And so I just want to move on to, if there's somebody out there that is struggling at the moment with their grief, they may be new to grief, they may be old to grief, but have you got any advice that might help them through at the moment? And that's to you, Gill.
It's a difficult question because, of course, we are all so different and we do all have to find our own way through grief. But I think there are better ways and not such helpful ways of grieving. So I think the things I'd say are it won't always feel this bad. As Jane said, that it never goes away. The hole is still there, but it is a lot less jagged around the edges. I think another thing I'd say is it's okay to feel difficult things. You know, grieving is not just about sadness. It's about uncomfortable feelings like anger and guilt and bitterness and envy. And I think we have to remember that it's okay to feel those things. And we also, it's really important that we try to let ourselves feel everything we're feeling, that we try not to sort of keep a lid on it. Because as Jane says, it will out in the end. And I think sometimes we actually have to actively, sort of consciously make space for grief. I don't know what Jane's experience of this is, but I mean, as a therapist, I ended up going back to work 2 months after Sam died. And, you know, that was pretty early, really. But the sort of deal I did with myself in going back was I will take longer breaks. I will try to give myself more time off, and I will try to create times when I can actually connect with my grief and with Sam. And I was quite active in that. You know, I would go and look at photos and play recordings of his voice, and I would really allow it to come. And I think, you know, don't be scared of grief. It will feel overwhelming at times, but actually what it costs us to keep it in is far worse than what it costs us to let it out. Yeah, do ask for help, because, you know, sometimes we need help with this, and particularly if you're feeling stuck, I would say to anyone, get help. There's plenty out there. You know, the project Jane runs, the Good Grief Project, looks absolutely fantastic, everything they do. And yeah, so I would say, yeah, do ask for help, and most of all, you know, on a practical level, keep on doing the things that you know help you. You know, for me, that was connecting with nature. It was walking the dog. It was having those routines. Really, really important. And I think most of all, keep alive the person who's died. You know, if we don't actively keep them alive, you know, if we don't allow ourselves to feel all the pain, then I've known people who somehow, in locking away the pain, also lock away all the good stuff. And that's that's really a tragedy, because what we have to learn to do is to accommodate the person who's died, you know, in a new way. We have to sort of develop a new relationship with them, so that we'll never move on. I mean, I hate it when people talk about moving on, because I don't think you do move on. But I think what you can do is move forward, and take that person with you.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. How about you, Jane?
Yeah, I so agree with Jill. I mean, you know, we have so much in common. Our boys were 22, which is staggering, really. 22 being very significant in your book as well.
Yes, it is.
But what I would say is that for me, what really helps is the discovery that grief is about openings, not closure. And for me, closure is the dirty C word. It really is. And that for me, discovering that grief isn't linear, that it isn't about the stages of grief, because the stages are really useful, but they all happen out of sync and in different order. And they happen when you least, you know, grief creeps up on you when you least expect it. So it's about being prepared for the unexpected. It's about shedding the burden of trying to present yourself in a way that's okay for other people. You have to actually make friends with your grief, and you have to allow other people, in a way, the right people, to see what that means. But I think it's important to choose who you share your grief with, because some people really, with the best will in the world, could be the kindest hearted in the world, aren't up for it or up to it, and they know that, but they don't know how to say it. So sometimes you have to help people to say, I don't know if I can help you. So choose who you talk to. Find peer support groups. The Compassionate Friends, for example, is a wonderful group. Find peer support so that people are speaking to you from the inside looking out. They get it from first-hand experience. I think continuing bonds is hugely important. You know, as I said before, it's learning to live with this new normal that is, I suppose it's about that hole in your heart, but actually with time, you become clearer and clearer that that isn't a hole anymore, that Josh is with me wherever I go. I take him with me comfortably almost, and I share my thinking with him, and I wonder about what it would be like, what Josh would be doing. But I also rejoice in the fact that through his death, amazing things have happened as well. And one of the things that I couldn't ever have imagined is that his brother fell in love with Josh's best friend, and they now have 2 babies together who are my grandchildren. And I'm so lucky to have other children, because lots of bereaved parents don't. I'm also really lucky to have grandchildren, because a lot of bereaved parents will never have grandchildren. But the thing is that out of the love shared for Josh, this amazing thing happened. And I would do anything to bring him back. But isn't that incredible that, you know, that connection, that continuing bond, that sort of love of Josh has connected so many people. And through our films, we've been able to share that with other people too. And I suppose you have to be open to whatever is going to happen next, because I would never have imagined my life would have taken the course it's taken. And I would have done everything to change it initially. But I think that with acceptance and forgiveness, and I mean self-forgiveness too, because I think every bereaved parent, as Jill knows, blames themselves to a certain degree, however illogical it is. We should never blame ourselves, but we do. And I think that we have to be kind to ourselves. And I would say to every bereaved parent, every bereaved person out there, be kind to yourself, because at the end of the day, if you don't forgive yourself, you're really going to struggle. And you need to be kind to yourself. I've had to be kind to myself, and I think Jill's clearly been kind to herself, and I think Mark, you've been kind to yourself too, because we've all lived a nightmare of the worst things that can happen, and yet we've all come through it. I think I can say stronger. I see Mark's strength, I see Jill's strength, I feel my strength, and it might sound strange to say, but I'm so happy to have learned this about myself and been able to meet the amazing, charismatic, powerful, wonderful, brave people that I've met through my learning, through what Josh has taught me in his short life, 22 years. I wish it could have been longer, but 22 years is quite a long time.
No, they're both incredible bits of advice, and I think it's a perfect way to end in a way. And I just want to thank you both.
Thank you. The Good Grief Festival, amazing. We need to find a more comfortable language, and that's what it's all about. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will just add my thanks to that too. Yeah, thank you both. It's been really lovely to meet you both.
Thank you, guys.